Good evening, Sukhi Hatu. Welcome to another weekly Facebook Dhamma Sharing with Brother Billy Tan. Please allow me to introduce Brother Billy. Brother Billy Tan is a retired Six Sigma business development consultant, and is certified as Master Practitioner of Neurolinguistic Programming, Clinical Hypnotherapist, Laughter Yoga Teacher, and Laughter Ambassador. In sharing the Dhamma, Brother Billy studied under the late Venerable Dr. Punaji Mahathera, and has delivered Dhamma sharing throughout Malaysia and other countries. In recent years, Brother Billy has also shared the Dhamma extensively in the Philippines, as resident Dhamma lecturer at Wisdom Park, Manila, as well as to Catholic seminary students, universities, theosophical societies, and to inmates at the women's prison in Metro Manila. Currently, Brother Billy is engaged in several humanitarian projects, to provide pandemic relief and assistance to underprivileged and marginalized communities in the Philippines, Sri Lanka and other Asian countries. Please join us to welcome Brother Billy, to offer his Dhamma sharing on the topic, with contentment comes tranquility. If you have any question pertaining to this topic, please post them as comments under this Facebook page. We would appreciate if you click like as you join this sharing. Thank you.
Good evening, Sukhi Hotu. Welcome to another sharing on Dhammapada Study. We're having this every Monday evening at 8:30 p.m. local time. Today's topic is with contentment comes tranquility. We will be studying two pairs of Dhammapada verses. They are paired together. So there are 4 verses we're going to look at. So these are two pairs. Basically centered around the topic of contentment. So before I begin, I would like to share this link. Please use this link to download the presentation slides that I will be using, so you can follow along the presentation easily. So, and if you have any questions, please feel free to post them as comments, and I will attend to them at the end of the sharing. Okay, and for those of you who are joining us, please click like so that I can know who has been joining us, right? All right, so let's begin with today's sharing on the topic, with contentment comes tranquility. Here, I use the term contentment referring to a person who is not seeking for things that are out of reach and chasing after things. We're talking about a person who finds his own surrounding to be adequate and contented with whatever he is presented with in life, right? And then from there, the person can basically cultivate a sense of peace of mind and bringing the mind to a state of tranquility. But in today's sharing, I will also touch on the Dhammapada verses, which talks about the highest state of tranquility, and that is where the mind has reached a state where the mind is completely cleansed of defilements, and such a person eventually would attain the state of Nibbana and become an Arahant. So we're going to explore those verses that touch on these, right? All right, so let us begin with today's sharing. All right. We begin with the story of the discontented young monk, right? So this came from a pair of Dhammapada verses, 186 and 187. So this is talking about this young monk who was discontented with his life as a monk. Now this is basically a stanza that the Buddha spoke while he was staying at Jetavana Monastery, referring to this discontented monk. Unfortunately, there was no mention of the name of this discontented monk. I'm not aware if it is mentioned anywhere else in commentaries, but as far as the commentary that I've been researching on, there was no mention of the name of this discontented monk. It was just referring to as the discontented monk. Okay. So the story goes that this monk was newly admitted into the order of the Sangha. And after he had joined the Sangha, he actually initially was very pleased to join the Sangha. So he made it his full profession. That means he gave up household life and treated the life of a monk, a monastic life, to be his lifelong pursuit. So he treated it as his full profession, and of course he studied under a preceptor, and also he had teachers under whom he was learning from. And then his preceptor one day just asked him to go to a certain place to learn, go to a certain monastery to learn about some of the monastic rules, because this is a newly ordained monk, so he's quite new to the monastic rules. That is the ordinances. Ordinance basically refers to laws and precepts and rules. So his preceptor told him to go to this such and such a place, which presumably is another monastery nearby, to study the ordinances, that is the monastic precepts, so that he can get used to it. Right? So, and no sooner had the monk gone there, then his father fell sick, and he received the news that his father, back in his own hometown, became very sick. And he was, of course, a little bit concerned for his own father. But as a monk who has been sent to a monastery to attend to a certain task, he was not able to leave his position to go back to his own home. Right? So now, at that time, the father became quite sick, and the father actually expressed to the rest of the family he really wanted to see this son who had become a monk. This is the older son. So he really wanted to see this son, but he was not able to get anyone to go and summon the son to come to him. Although they sent the news to the son that the father was sick, no one was able to go and fetch the monk to come and see the father. So the father really wanted to see his own son who had already become a monk. And then, of course, as the father's sickness grew worse during his dying moment, these are his last moments, the father really began to talk to himself, talking a lot, chattering to himself, and talking about how much he missed his son, how much he loved his son. So the father was starting to express a lot of this kind of things during his final days. And eventually he took his whatever money, whatever wealth he had, and gave it to the youngest son, and said to his youngest son, "Take this money and use it to buy a bowl and robe for my son." So in other words, he instructed his young son to take this remaining money that the father had to now dana the older brother, who has now become a monk, dana him with a new bowl and also robe, right, for the monastic, for the monk son, right? So having given that instruction to the youngest son, the father passed away. So the father now passed away, and the young son then had to go and look for his older brother. So when the young monk eventually heard about it, he then, of course, saw his young brother and made his way back to his old home. And when he arrived there, his youngest brother flung himself onto the feet of this monk, and rolling on the ground was weeping, and said to his older brother, he says, "Venerable, your father was praising you when he died, and placed in my hand 100 pieces of gold. What shall I do with it?" So the young brother told the monk that now the father left behind his final wealth, final money that he had, that is 100 pieces of gold, and asked the monk, what should they spend it on? And the young monk refused to accept the money, because he learned, of course, from his monastic precepts he's not allowed to accept money. And therefore he responded, I have no need for this money. So he refused to accept the money at first. But then after some time, he thought about it, right? And then he thought to himself, this monk was thinking to himself, what is the use of living if I am obliged to gain my living by going from house to house for alms? This 100 pieces of gold is enough to keep me well fed. I shall return to the life of a layman. So this young monk was quite discontented with the fact that he had to go around from house to house getting alms food. But now that his father left behind this small fortune of 100 pieces of gold, he thought he can now spend the rest of his life using this money to feed himself, and he doesn't have to practice this as a monk anymore. So he was actually a little bit discontented as a monk because he was still new to the life and he was not used to it. So now he was just thinking to himself, maybe he could use this money. And therefore, he was now oppressed with discontent. The more he saw the money, the more he realized that there is this money available to him, the more he felt discontented with the life of a monk. So he realized that, he could live as a layperson with this money, and that's what he thought. So as a result of that, even though he has not disrobed yet, he actually stopped chanting and recitation of the sacred text, and he stopped practicing meditation. So when he went back to the monastery, he stopped doing these things. And then he began to look like he was getting sick. So he started to look like he was getting sick because he stopped chanting, he stopped reciting the holy text, and he stopped practicing meditation. And the young monks around him, they were wondering, the youths are the young monks who were living in the monastery. Then they asked him, what is the matter? So basically this discontented monk responded. He says, I am discontented. Basically expressing that now he really wants to give up the holy life. So these his brother monks, the other youths, those young monks around him, they reported the matter to his preceptor first, and then went on to report to his teacher. And then later on, they all brought the young monk to see the Buddha and explain what was the matter with him. Explain to the Buddha that this young monk has now stopped chanting, stopped reciting the holy text, and stopped practicing meditation, and literally wants to give up monastic life. So the Buddha, having heard that, then asked the young monk, the discontented monk, is the report true that you are discontented? Of course, the Buddha wanted to get the monk to speak for himself. And of course, the discontented monk responded, yes, Venerable. And the Buddha then asked again, why have you acted this way? Have you any means of livelihood? Because if this young monk gave up his monastic life, he would have to return to household life. How could he support himself? And of course, this young monk was very proud to say, yes, Venerable. Right? How great is your wealth? And the young one went on to say, 100 pieces of gold. And of course, then the Buddha asked, very well, just fetch a few potsherds hither. We will count them and find out whether or not you have sufficient means of livelihood. Now, potsherds are basically pieces of pottery, right? Various pieces of pottery. So the Buddha asked him to bring these pieces of pottery and then look at what you need to sustain a household life and whether your 100 pieces of gold would be sufficient. So the discontented monk then brought these potsherds, these pieces of pottery. And then the Buddha said to him, Now then, set aside 50 for food and drink, 24 for 2 bullocks, and an equal number for seed, for 2 bullock plow, for a spade, and for a razor adze. So basically what the Buddha was asking is that now that you have 100 pieces, first you set aside 50 pieces of gold to take care of your food and drink, right, for some years to come. And then set aside 24 pieces so that you can buy these bullocks, right? The carts, the carts that are drawn by the bulls or the cows, so that he needs to buy these 2 of those, because he needs to plant for food, because he cannot just live on the money alone, so he has to plant his own food, and also equal amount for seeds and for the necessary planting tools, the farming tools. So in other words, Buddha was asking him, set aside that money, how much you need for this, how much you need for that. So as the young monk started to count that, he realized the result of the count proved that the 100 gold pieces would not be sufficient even to get him started. Talking about putting aside 50 pieces for food and drinks, and then buying all these things in order to start the career as a farmer so that he is able to plant his own food. He would not even have enough to get started, right? And that was when the Buddha then instructed this young monk. He says, monk, the pieces of gold which you possess are but few in number. How can you hope to satisfy your desire with so few as these? So in other words, the Buddha was highlighting the fact that 100 pieces of gold is really nothing. If you really wanted to give up the monastic life and go on your own back to lay life, these 100 pieces would not be sufficient. And then the Buddha went on to explain about how people have been able to sustain themselves. So he pointed out, he says, in times past lived men who exercised sway as universal monarchs, men who by a mere waving of the arms were able to cause a rain of jewel to fall, covering the ground for 12 leagues waist deep with jewels. These men ruled as kings until 36 sakas had passed, and although exercising sovereignty over the deities for so long, they too passed without having fulfilled their desires. So what the Buddha was pointing out that is that during the past times, right, a lot of these very wealthy people, they had so much money that they literally buried themselves waist deep in gold, and they could afford just about anything. And despite all that they could live on, somehow they were still not satisfied with whatever they had. They were not able to fulfill their desires with all the money they had, let alone this 100 pieces of gold that this young discontented monk had. So these very wealthy people themselves also were not able to fulfill all their desires. So what the Buddha was highlighting was the fact that even if you had a lot of money, so wealthy, you could afford just about anything, you would still have desires that could never be satisfied. Right? This is what the Buddha was really pointing out, that despite great wealth, people are still pursuing various desires that they are not able to fulfill. So therefore, the Buddha then gave the following instructions, and that became Dhammapada verse 186 and 187. So the Buddha said, there is no satisfying sensual desires, even with the rain of gold coins, for sensual pleasures give little satisfaction and much pain. Having understood this, the wise man finds no delight, even in heavenly pleasures. The disciple of the Supreme Buddha delights in the destruction of craving. So here the Buddha basically pointed out that everyone has various kinds of sensual desires. Here he's referring to the lay people. Lay people have all kinds of sensual desires. And even with so much gold that they possess, they could never satisfy all the sensual desires. And pointing out that when you have these sensual desires, seeking for sensual pleasures, it will not bring satisfaction. It will bring pain and suffering. And therefore, the only way one can find peace, right, is basically to be wise enough to understand that and become a disciple of the Buddha. And by becoming a disciple of the Buddha, then you start to practice abandoning craving, destruction of craving. Right? This is to give up all craving. So basically, this is what the Buddha was trying to teach this discontented monk. Well, the Dhammapada commentaries did not go on to say what would have happened, but I guess if the story was not expanded any further, it is very likely that this discontented monk eventually continued to become a monk and gave up his hope to become a lay person, trying to live off this 100 pieces, because that 100 pieces of gold is really nothing, hardly enough to even help him to get started in lay life. So I guess presumably that this young discontented monk eventually gave up his dream of going back to lay life and continued to become a young monk. And so this is really what the Buddha uttered. So the verse, let's examine the actual Pali translation, right? So here it's talking about this shower of gold coins, and basically talking about the full satisfaction of desires for sensualities cannot be found, and is not seen, is not witnessed, cannot ever be found. So even with so much gold, sensual pleasures can never be fully satisfied. And therefore, sensual pleasures really give no satisfaction, can never be satisfied, and it is painful. And then the Buddha went on to say that having understood this, then the wise people fully understand this, and they give up the pursuit of sensual pleasures. So this is the first verse, 186. Right, now let's take a look at well, this is the translation. There is no satisfying sensual desires, even with the rain of gold coins. For sensual pleasures give little satisfaction and much pain. So wise people realize that pursuing sensual pleasures can never be satisfied and can only bring pain. Then verse 187, let's examine the Pali translation. The disciples of the Supreme Buddha, Sammasambuddha, right, is a wise person. Such a wise person will not approach the indulgence of sensual pleasures, even in heavenly joys. That means even for a person who has accumulated merits and reborn in the heavens, experiencing heavenly joys, even that is not enough for the disciple of the Supreme Buddha to pursue. So in other words, the Buddha here was not only referring to human life, but also heavenly life. That the wise person who has become a disciple of the Supreme Buddha will not seek the ultimate of going to heaven, right? It would be attaining the freedom of all suffering. So he is fixed on the destruction of craving. So in other words, for a person who truly follows the teachings of the Buddha, he is not even seeking going to heaven. His ultimate attainment, his ultimate goal is to become free from all suffering, to destroy all craving. So their ultimate goal is the destruction of all craving. So the verse basically says, having understood this, the wise man finds no delight even in heavenly pleasures. The disciple of the Supreme Buddha delights in the destruction of craving. Now, notice in the Pali, on the upper paragraph, the last statement there, Sama Sambuddha Savaka. Sama Sambuddha Savako. This is really referring to Sama Sambuddha, that is the Supreme Buddha, Gautama Buddha himself at this point in time. That means these supremely enlightened Buddhas, the Sama Sambuddha. Savako. Savako is referring to a disciple of the Buddha. So Sama Sambuddha Savako means the disciple of the Sama Sambuddha, one who follows the supremely enlightened Buddha. So this is the verse. Now let's examine this part. Sama Sambuddha Savaka. Right? Sama Sambuddha refers to the supremely enlightened Buddha, and that is Gautama Buddha in this context. Right? There had been, according to the commentaries, there had been 28 such Buddhas that is known, and Gautama Buddha would be the last one so far. There had been several before that. In the last sharing, I spoke about many lifetimes before Prince Siddhartha became enlightened. He, in one of his early lives, he was a young ascetic by the name of Sumedha who met the Buddha Dipankara. Right? So that would be one of the early Buddhas, Sama Sambuddha. So this Sama Sambuddha is referring to this supremely enlightened Buddha. Savaka is the disciple. The long line of monk disciples of the Buddha started with the promulgation of the first sermon. So here, this commentary here is referring to the long line of these disciples, the Savakas. They started with, at that time, in this context, it would be Gautama Buddha delivering the first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra, because there, the Buddha, when he first became enlightened, when Prince Siddhartha eventually became enlightened, he went to look for the 5 ascetics whom he practiced asceticism together and wanted to explain to them that asceticism is not the way. So he finally found them, and the 5 of them, the names are there: Kondana, Bhaddiya, Vappa, Mahanama, and Asaji. Kondana being the most senior, he's the oldest of all. The other are younger, much younger, one generation younger, actually. So, in other words, the community of Sangha, when we talk about Sangha, we're talking about 5 disciples or more, okay? So here, it all started with this first sermon that the Buddha delivered to these 5 ascetics who became his disciples. Right? Let's take a look at the story behind all this. When Prince Siddhartha was first born, right? So in other words, at the birth of young Prince Siddhartha, his father, King Suddhodana, summoned 8 Brahmins. Brahmins are wise men, so to speak. These are highly educated, highly intellectual people. So King Suddhodana summoned 8 of them from across the country, asking them to come and witness this newborn prince that he had, Prince Siddhartha, and asked them to name him. Right? So there were 8 such Brahmins. 8 wise men came to the palace of King Suddhodana to name the young prince, to witness the young prince. Kondana was at that time the youngest of these 8. So Kondana at that time was a young Brahmin. He was the youngest, and in fact, he was also the most brilliant of the 8, the cleverest of the 8 Brahmins who came. And these other 4 ascetics who attended the Buddha's first sermon, right? They were in fact the sons of the other Brahmins. So out of the remaining Brahmins, then the sons of four of them were the other four ascetics. So in other words, Kondana was one generation above the other four ascetics. So the five of them practiced asceticism together. So over the years, as Prince Siddhartha grew up, the Brahmins, the elderly Brahmins, all passed away, and Kondana was the youngest. And then the sons of those who passed away then joined Kondana together and practiced asceticism. Right? So as young Prince Siddhartha was growing up, these five ascetics, they had retired to the forest and practiced asceticism, while in anticipation of this Bodhisattva Siddhartha to attain Buddhahood, because Kondana knew, together with the other Brahmins who visited King Suddhodana, they knew that Prince Siddhartha would have either become a great ruler or become a great teacher. But they had faith that Prince Siddhartha would become a great teacher. So the five ascetics started practicing together in anticipation that young Prince Siddhartha, the Bodhisattva Siddhartha, would eventually attain Buddhahood. They were waiting for him so that they could all get together. So the five ascetics eventually met up with Bodhisattva Siddhartha, because as the story goes, for those of you who are well aware, right, after seeing the four great signs, Prince Siddhartha was discontented with palace life, his princely life, and left the palace, left the comfort of the royal household, and became an ascetic. And that was when these five ascetics met up with Prince Siddhartha. Of course, when Prince Siddhartha, Bodhisattva Siddhartha, left the palace, he first sought two teachers, but after learning from two teachers, he was not contented with, was not satisfied with what he learned, because it did not take him to the highest level. And then, as how it had developed, he met up with these five ascetics, and together they practiced asceticism. This is basically extreme practices of self-torture, self-torment. Okay. Then eventually, Bodhisattva Siddhartha was dissatisfied with the practice of asceticism. He realized it was not going to bring him to enlightenment, because when they practice asceticism, they starve themselves, and they try not to eat, they try not to drink. And in fact, at one time, Siddhartha also tried not to breathe, and that was when he fainted. And when he woke from the fainting, he realized that was not the way. He nearly died. He was so thin, he nearly died. And therefore, he realized that was not the way. He abandoned asceticism and began to take some food, a little bit of food from time to time, to nourish his body, so that he can heal his body back to full health, so that he can continue to practice. So he was taking food sparingly to regain his health, to regain the lost strength. And when he did that, the five ascetics were very disappointed. They thought that, they gave up on Prince Siddhartha. They gave up on Bodhisattva Siddhartha, thinking that, this Bodhisattva is never going to achieve the ultimate attainment. So they left him, they departed from him. So they abandoned him and deserted him, and went on to Isipatana. Okay, that's another place, not too far away from Bodh Gaya. So then, of course, Bodhisattva Siddhartha started to move on, and eventually he became enlightened. So soon after their separation, the Bodhisattva attained supreme awakening as the Sammasambuddha. So when he first attained this awakening, this Sammasambuddha state, it was actually the full moon of Vesak. And then he spent 7 weeks around the Bodhi tree in the areas around the Bodhi tree, also in gratitude for the Bodhi tree having provided him with the shelter. And so he was actually grateful to that. So he spent the 7 weeks doing walking meditation and also deep meditation and contemplated on Paticca Samuppada and all that. So finally, after 7 weeks, he left the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya and went to look for the 5 ascetics so that he would be able to teach the 5 ascetics what he had learned. Eventually, Gautama Buddha went in search of the 5 ascetics, and 2 months or 2 full moons after he had become enlightened, so this would be roughly 8 weeks. So 7 weeks in around the Bodhi tree, and then 1 week looking for the 5 ascetics. So 8 weeks after he became enlightened, so this is 2 full moons later, on the night of the Asaha full moon, he finally met up with the 5 ascetics. And the newly enlightened Gautama Buddha then delivered the first sermon to them, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra. And from there, this is how the community of Sangha began, with these 5 ascetics who then became disciples of the Buddha. Right? And thereafter, of course, Kondana, being the smartest, cleverest, he was also the eldest and most matured and wisest amongst the 5 ascetics. He was the first to become enlightened. So he himself became an arahant. So I guess you can say he would be the first arahant, right? So eventually the other 4 ascetics also attained arahantship. So over time, the 5 of them all became arahants. Kondana being the first one, because he was the most elderly and most matured and most experienced. And out of the 5, the youngest one, Asaji, he was the one who actually met up with Sariputta, who was just a young ascetic at the time, and converted Sariputta to join with the community of Sangha to follow the Buddha. So Asaji was the one who converted Venerable Sariputta, who later became one of the chief disciples of the Buddha, together with Venerable Moggallana. So this is, these stories, I think many of us are fully aware of it. The 2 chief disciples are Sariputta and Moggallana. So this is really the story behind these 5 ascetics, how they started as the Sama Sambuddha Savaka. And from then on, the number of disciples of the supremely enlightened Buddha, the Sama Sambuddha, right, the disciples, the Sama Sambuddha Savaka, started to grow very rapidly. So the numbers reached very high, I think more than 1,000. Nobody really had the full numbers, but obviously it would have to go into 1,000, because at the time when the Buddha had passed, at the time when the Buddha finally died the Buddha passed after 45 years of teaching, many of the arahants would have also passed by that time, including Moggallana and Sariputta. So the original disciples, the original arahants, the early arahants, they would have passed also, right? So by the time the Buddha passed, 45 years after teaching as the Gautama Buddha, Sama Sambuddha, he would have had more than 1,000 arahants, right? 1,000 disciples who became arahant. So this is really the story about this Sama Sambuddha Savaka. Okay, and of course he delivered the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra to these 5 ascetics, setting into motion the wheel of Dharma. Right? And of course the Dhammacakkappavattana was centered around the 4 noble truths, dukkha, that there is dukkha, that there is the origin of dukkha, and dukkha can be brought to an end, and there is a way that leads to the cessation of all dukkha. So this is, of course, something that we all know about, right? for those of us who are familiar with this basic story. Okay? So the two verses are, there is no satisfying sensual desires, even with the rain of gold coins, for sensual pleasures give little satisfaction and much pain. Having understood this, the wise man finds no delight even in heavenly pleasures. The disciples of the Supreme Buddha delights in the destruction of craving. Right? So now this is talking about that this is really talking about the discontented monk, and therefore this is the advice the Buddha gave to that discontented monk. Right? Let's look at another story, very interesting story. Right? So let's look at the two verses first, very quickly. That says, those who have not led the holy life, nor have acquired wealth in time of youth, like flightless old cranes languishing in a lake with no fish. So here, this verse was basically stating that for people who have not given up household life and taken up the robes to to become a monk, or people who have not acquired wealth, if they want to continue a household life, then they would need to acquire great wealth. So people who have done neither of these two things, that means either they would have acquired a lot of wealth and lived happily as householders, or they give up household life and become monks. Now, if they have done neither of these, then the Buddha was saying that they would be like flightless old cranes languishing in a lake with no fish. That means these like these storks, right? These birds that are unable to fly, they are too old, and they are now languishing in a lake which has no fish, so they would not have sufficient food to keep them satisfied. So basically, this is what this verse meant. And the Buddha went on to say the next verse, those who have not led the holy life nor have acquired wealth in time of youth, like spent arrows fallen from the bow, sighing over past glory. So here the Buddha was using the metaphor of arrows which are old and used and no longer useful. When you try to shoot them, they cannot shoot straight anymore. They just fall off the bow. And assuming that these arrows have memory, so they will just fall off the bow. They can no longer achieve what they were designed for. So the bow can no longer strike anything. Therefore, it would be sighing over past glory. So this is really the metaphor for people who are not able to accumulate wealth in their youth when they are living the household life, or people who are not, who have not given up household life and become monks. Right? So let's take a look at the story behind this. Right? This is the story of a person called Great Wealth, right? Mahadana. Here, Dana, D-H-A-N-A, simply means a person with wealth. So Mahadana means a person with great wealth. So his nickname would be Great Wealth. The Buddha spoke these verses, these two verses there, while residing in Isipatana, with reference to this young man, Mahadana, of great wealth, who was the son of a very wealthy man. Now, in ancient times in India, it is quite common that in the town, the richest man in the town is often referred to as the treasurer of the town, so or village. So in any village or any town, the most wealthy person there is often referred to as the treasurer. So this Mahadana is the son of such a very wealthy person. They call the treasurer. Okay. So Great Wealth was born in a place in Benares. Benares is quite near the Ganges River. So was born in a place near Benares in a wealthy household, And this wealthy household has amassed a great wealth of 80 billion treasures. Now, of course, when they use the word treasures, I don't know exactly what they're referring to. It could be referring to gold pieces, or it could be referring to jewels, or whatever it is. So basically, it's a great wealth of 80 billion. Now, think about it. Even if it is a coin, 80 billion coins is a lot of money, right? So here, if we're talking about a piece of gold, 80 billion pieces of gold, that's a lot of money. So Great Wealth was the son of such, was born in the household where they had such wealth. So presumably he would be the only son there. So his mother and father was thinking to themselves, because they are so wealthy, that now they have this son. They say, we have a vast store of wealth in our house, and there is no necessity that our son should do anything other than enjoy himself according to his own good pleasure. In other words, they basically pointed out that their son had good karma of being born in such a wealthy family. Therefore, why should he slog and work and what? He should be enjoying himself, enjoying his good fortune of being born in such a wealthy family. So in other words, the mother and father was actually going to spoil the son. They were not going to let the son work for anything. Right? So accordingly, they had him instructed in singing and in playing musical instruments. And that was all the instruction he ever received all his life. So in other words, this young man called Great Wealth, he was basically spoiled. He was just living in luxury, and the only thing he ever learned was how to sing and how to play music instruments. He never learned how to earn a living. He did not have any skill other than sing and play music. So he was not able to really find his own livelihood. So, and likewise, in the same village or same city, in another household, also very wealthy and basically the equivalent, also with 80 billion treasures, a daughter was born. And likewise, the parents of that daughter thought the same thing. Right? The thought occurred to the mother and father of the young girl that they had her instructed only in dancing and singing. In other words, that young girl was not taught how to do anything else other than enjoying herself with singing and dancing. So finally, when these two young people reach the proper age, right, presumably in their late teens, then they were married with the customary ceremonies. Remember that in ancient India in those days, that they have to match, there's a caste system. They have to match what level of wealth you are. You only marry into another family who have similar level of status in terms of wealth, in terms of reputation, and in terms of accomplishments in life. So you don't marry someone below, and you will not be able to find someone way above you who would be willing to marry you. So they will look for people of equivalent wealth. So here, these are two very wealthy families with 80 billion of treasures each. And the son and the daughter eventually got married together, right? And of course, over time, their parents would have passed away. In the course of time, both mothers and fathers died. And then the young couple inherited twice 80 billion treasures. So in other words, the man inherited 80 billion, the lady inherited another 80 billion. Between the two of them, now they have twice 80 billion treasures in their household now, in the household of this young man called Great Wealth. And it was the custom of the treasurer's son to pay respect to the king, because you're a wealthy person. So it's very customary that wealthy families want the protection of the king and want to also please the king, to get favors from the king, so that the king would also help them. And sometimes these wealthy families are involved with collecting tax for the king and so on. So it is customary that the head of the household would visit the king regularly. So therefore, it was the custom of the treasurer's son to go thrice a day to wait upon the king, to visit the king, right, and pay respect to the king. So one day, a company of knaves. Now, knaves refer to people who are cheats, con men, right? And these are people who basically cheat other people for a living, cheats and con men. So one day, a company of knaves who lived nearby thought to themselves, if this treasurer's son would get drunk, it would be convenient for us to profit from this. Let us show him how to get drunk. So they struck up with a nice an idea how to profit from this treasurer's son, get him drunk and then cheat him. So accordingly, they procured strong drink. Here it was in the commentary, they just said strong drink, but presumably it was referring to intoxicants, right? Liquor, all kinds of liquor and intoxicants. Maybe drugs included, I don't know. So basically it's talking about intoxicants. And then they put roast meat, right? So that the meat can go along with the drinking. They put roast meat and garnishes, all kinds of stuff to go along with it. And then they position themselves conveniently along the path where great wealth would pass by every day. So in other words, when great wealth traveled daily to visit the king and come back, these knaves, these cheats, would position themselves along the way. And when they saw great wealth approaching, then they began to drink the intoxicants and showed how enjoyable the pleasures of food and intoxicating drink would be. So they were actually enjoying themselves in front of great wealth. Of course, great wealth had never done this before. He was very curious. So, and they said to him, he says, live for 100 years, O master treasurer's son. With your help, may we all be enabled to eat and drink to our heart's content. So in other words, these cheats were declaring to to great wealth and say, help us, let us all be merry, enjoy ourselves, eat and drink, and then with your wealth, we can all be very happy and pass the day happily. Of course, great wealth at that time, his parents were no longer around to advise him, so he was very curious. So he asked his servant or his attendant, what are these men doing? What are they drinking? So he was curious. And of course, the servants, being people of the streets, they know. They say, oh, a certain drink, master. Right? Does it taste good? And the servant would say, master, in this world of the living, there is no kind of drink that can be compared to this. Right? So in other words, they were saying that this intoxicating drink is the best thing you can ever drink. Right? There's nothing that can compare to this. So great wealth was kind of curious. He wanted to try it. Oh, in that case, said great wealth, I must have some too. So he started to taste them. And of course, the intoxicating drink made him feel very good because it put him into a state of bliss. So he asked the attendant to fetch him first a little, and then a little more, and a little more. And then he just kept drinking them. He started to enjoy them. Little by little, he started to drink more and more. And before long, those knaves succeeded in having great wealth take up the habit of drinking. He had now fallen into their trap. So in other words, he had now become addicted to these intoxicating drinks. He became a drunkard. So alcoholic, as we call it in modern days. So he started to enjoy all these intoxicating drinks. Then they flocked around him, these knaves, these cheats, and right, these con men and cheats. They started to surround him, and they made him very popular amongst the crowd, and he became a very popular celebrity in public. And of course, great wealth loved it because he was getting all the attention. All he knew was how to sing and play music instrument, and he didn't know what else to do. He was not really street smart. In fact, he was quite dumb here, following these cheats and con men. Okay? And as time went by, the crowd surrounded him and increased in numbers. More and more people gathered around him, and he became very popular. He loved that. So he was so popular, he started throwing money around. Okay, he would spend 100 pieces of treasures at a time on intoxicating drink. So to him, 100 pieces of gold is nothing. He can just buy a lot of drink and start drinking and splash it around. And it became a habit with him. After a time, wherever he went, to pile up a heap of coins and call out as he drank. So in other words, everywhere he went, he would take out some money and splash it on the table or whatever to show it off and say, "Take this coin and fetch me flowers. Take this coin and fetch me perfumes. This man is clever at dicing, and this man at dancing, and this man at singing, and this man at the playing of musical instruments. Give this man 1,000 pieces." Sorry. Give this man 1,000 pieces and give that man 2,000 pieces. In other words, he was throwing his money around, seeing somebody who's able to sing and dance, play instrument, and do things, and he started to tip them heavy tips. So, of course, he had 80 billion himself to give away, right? And we know what could happen eventually. In due course, in this manner, great wealth squandered all the 80 billion of treasures that he had inherited from his own parents. So now he had lost all the money he had inherited from his parents, the 80 billion. But remember, he also married a wife who had another 80 billion. So then the thieves and the con men and the cheats then asked great wealth, "Master, your wealth is all spent. Don't you have any more?" So great wealth thought about it and then asked his servant and he instructed his servant, "Has my wife no money? Well then, fetch that to me too." In other words, he instructed his servant to take all the money from his wife so that he's able to then spend it also. And soon he spent all his wife's 80 billion of treasures in the same manner. Now he has completely spent his 80 billion and his wife's 80 billion. In other words, they are completely broke by now. Okay? So broke that they have to start selling off everything they have. As time went by, he sold off all his family properties. Whatever property his father left behind, he sold them off. Sold off his carriages, disposed of all the vessels and all the jewelry and whatever he has, all the furnitures and even the clothing and all the belongings of any value, they were all sold off in order to support his drinking habit, his riotous living. And by now, he would have sold off everything. And finally, he sold off his house. And those to whom he sold his house, they took possession of the house and kicked him out of the house, because now they bought over the house. He no longer owns the house. He has to leave the house. So he kicked great wealth and his wife out of the house. So now they are homeless, penniless and homeless. Thereupon, taking his wife with him, he found lodging in between the house walls of other people's houses. What is this? This is basically, between houses, there's a small little space. So he just climbed into this little space between other people's houses and lived there because he has no house, no place to live. So he's basically living in these corners, right? Dark alleys and corners, and wherever he could find space to live in. And he only had broken pots with him. With broken pot in his hand, he would go about begging for food and basic necessities. Remember that he had no skill at earning a livelihood. He wouldn't know how to earn a living. and therefore the only thing he could do was beg for food. And what he had remaining were broken pots. Right? And eventually, he began to eat other people's leftover food. So in other words, if he was not able to get enough food from his begging, he would go to people's backyard rubbish bin to dig out food that is thrown away. It's quite pathetic. It's really very sad for one person to end up like that. So one day, he stood at the door of a rest house and receiving leftover of food presented to him by novices and probationers. So in other words, these young novice monks, they were having dana at these houses or these resting places where the monks would rest. See, in those days, monks traveled from village to village. And when they arrive at a village, if they don't have a place to stay, then people would offer rest houses, little shelters for them to stay. And then the people in the village would dana food to the monks. So at the end of the dana, whatever food that the monk were not able to finish eating, then this is the kind of food that this great wealth would then have to take over. So he stood at outside these rest houses where these young monks were staying and receiving leftover dana food. Right? And the Buddha, of course, accompanied some of these monks. And then one day the Buddha was there and saw great wealth and his wife in such pathetic conditions. And Buddha, of course, smiled a little. And Ananda, who was actually attending to the Buddha at the time, was curious why the Buddha smiled. So Ananda then asked the Buddha, "Oh, Master, why did you smile?" And the Buddha explained the reason for his smile by explaining to Ananda. He says, "Ananda, look here at great wealth, the treasurer's son. He had squandered twice 80 billion of treasures, and now, accompanied by his wife, he is begging for alms." Now, the Buddha had the power to see his own past lives, the power to see other people's past lives, and also the ability to fully comprehend the rising and falling of everything that is happening around him. So the Buddha went on to explain to Ananda and said that, for if in the prime of his life, this man, great wealth, had not squandered his wealth, but had applied himself to business, he would have become the principal treasurer of this very city. And if he then had retreated from the world and become a monk, he would have attained arahantship, and his wife would have been established in the fruit of the third path. So in other words, the Buddha was seeing that if things had turned out differently for great wealth, if this great wealth at his young age when he inherited the 80 billion and his wife inherited the 80 billion, if they had applied their inheritance to do business, they would be the richest person in that city. That's why you say principal treasurer. That is the richest person in that city. So in other words, the two of them with their wealth combined, if they had applied it to business, they would have been the richest persons in that city. Now, if they had been contented with their life and decided to give up household life and become a monk, and the Buddha went on to say, if great wealth gave up that household life and become a monk, by that time, he would have attained arahantship. He could have attained arahantship if he had done that. And his wife would have attained the third path, that is the anagami. So in other words, great wealth could have become an arahant and his wife could have become an anagami had they given up household life and become monks, right? Become monastics. So this is really what the Buddha was trying to say, explain to Ananda. This could have happened if great wealth knew how to spend the money he had. And then this was when great wealth was young. So now the Buddha went on to explain in the next phase of his life, if great wealth, right now, assuming great wealth didn't quite succeed in doing that, but in a later part in his life, maybe in middle age, in the middle, if in middle life, that means during the middle age of great wealth, he had not accomplished the earlier accomplishments, then if in middle life, he had not squandered his wealth by that time, but had applied himself to business, he would have become the second treasurer in this city. In other words, great wealth, if he didn't maybe apply to business in the early young years, but in his middle age, he went on to do business with whatever money he had left, he could have become the second richest person in the city, right? The second treasurer. And if he had retreated from the world then, which means given up household life and become a monk, he would have attained the fruit of the third path, and his wife would have been established in the fruit of the second path. So in other words, if great wealth had continued until middle age and then only become a monk at middle age, he would have attained anagami state of attainment, and his wife would have become sakadagami, second path, right? So the Buddha was pointing out, was predicting that would have happened to great wealth if he had given up household life in middle age. And now the Buddha went on to explain, if that didn't happen in his old age, so in other words, great wealth did not give up household life in his middle age, and finally in his old age he did that. If in the later years of his life, that means when he reached elderly state, he had not squandered the wealth but had applied himself to business, he would have become the third treasurer in this very city. So in other words, if great wealth had not squandered his wealth by the time he reached his old age, but in old age, if he spent that money in business, he would have become the third richest person in the city. And then the Buddha went on to explain. And if he had then retreated from the world and become a monk, he would have obtained the fruit of the second path, and his wife would have been established in the fruit of conversion. In other words, if he had not become a monk in his young days or in his middle age, and finally in his old elderly years, he then abandoned or gave up the household life and become a monk, he would have become a sakadagami. He could have become a sakadagami, a second path. And his wife would have become a sotapan, the fruit of conversion, which is the first path, right? So this is what the Buddha was saying, that great wealth could have a life that ended up like that if he had not squandered all his wealth. But now he has fallen away from the wealth of a layman, and he has likewise fallen away from the estate of a religious person. So in other words, the Buddha said, it is now, he has reached a point where he has no longer have all this wealth, he has squandered it all away, and he has not cultivated himself to become a religious person. And he has become like a heron in a dried up pond. So the Buddha was using the metaphor of this heron, a stalk, right? And that in a pond where there's no fish, right? So they would be starving. And then the Buddha pronounced the two stanzas. Pronounced these stanzas. This is Dhammapada verse 155. Those who have not led the holy life nor have acquired wealth in time of youth, like flightless old cranes languishing in a lake with no fish. Those who have not led the holy life nor have acquired wealth in time of youth, like spent arrows fallen from a bow, sighing over past glory. So here the Buddha was pointing out that either you accumulate wealth when you're young so that you live your old age wealthy, or rather well off, able to support yourself, happily if you are living a lay life, or you live the household life and become a monk. Then your life would be filled with peace and tranquility. Now, this is the sign of contentment. If you are contented with having the wealth, right, you can then give up the wealth and take up monkhood, right, and become a monk. Or otherwise, you apply yourself and apply your wealth to do business, right? So this is really what the Buddha then, why the Buddha uttered these two verses. Let's look at the translation. It says, not having led the holy life, not accumulating during the prime of one's youth, wealth, right? Like emaciated, or which is weak, right? Useless and weak, flightless herons, wasting away in a fishless pond or fishless lake. So, in other words, if you don't lead the holy life, or if you don't take the opportunity to accumulate enough wealth when you are young, then you will end up like an old heron wasting away in a fishless lake. Right? So this is really what the Buddha pointed out first. Those who have not led the holy life, nor have acquired wealth in time of youth, like flightless old cranes languishing in a lake with no fish. And the next verse, the same thing, not having led the holy life, not accumulating in the prime of one's youth wealth, right? Then one will regret, like an arrow, a spent arrow being falling off the bow. It's not even flying. The arrow cannot fly anymore. It's an old spent arrow that is not capable of flight, right? And sighing over past glory. So this is the translation. And that is what the Buddha said, right? So that first verse and then that second verse. Those who have not led the holy life, nor have acquired wealth in time of youth, like spent arrows fallen from the bow, sighing over past glory. From this story and from the explanation in the Dhammapada commentaries, and from the Buddha's utterance of these verses, it is very clear that the Buddha did point out, if you don't want to become, if you don't want to give up household life and become a monk, then you better make good use of your youth and accumulate enough wealth so that you have enough put away so that you can then live in peace and some level of comfort. Here, the Buddha was not highlighting pleasures. He was basically pointing out at basic livelihood, that you should basically work hard. If you don't want to become a monk, right, you want to continue to live a household life, then you better work hard, accumulate enough wealth to keep yourself, support yourself, so you don't have to be like old cranes languishing in a fishless lake, or like spent arrows sighing over past glory. And here it's clear that the Buddha is not against people accumulating wealth. He is just pointing out that we should not indulge in sensual pleasures. You know, I hear some people mentioning, oh, Buddhists should not be wealthy, and that is not correct. We're not saying that you should be the richest man around. But what is important to understand is that during the prime of your youth, if you are not ready to give up household life to become a monk, then you better spend that time wisely and accumulate enough wealth so that you are able to apply yourself and be more comfortable. Not talking about sensual pleasures or lust or indulgence in pleasures. Talking about survival and be comfortable and not having to suffer. So this is a very important eye-opener, that the Buddha is not against people accumulating wealth. He is just pointing out we should not indulge in sensual pleasures. So I hope this these Dhammapada verses have helped us understand better where the Buddha was coming from, right? The teachings of the Buddha. So these are very helpful, because when I came across this, I also realized that the Buddha was not against people accumulating wealth. There's nothing wrong with accumulation of wealth. It is only not indulge in sensual pleasures and then make good use of your wealth. Because if you are wealthy, you are able to use that wealth to help other people, right? If you have no money, how can you, donate any money to anybody? But if you have a lot of wealth, you can actually donate it to help other people. This is very, very important lesson. Therefore, it is important to remember that the Buddha is not against accumulation of wealth. Okay. So with that, I end my sharing. I hope it has been helpful. You can remember to download the slides if you want the details. So let's take a look and see if there are any questions. Any questions there? So far, I haven't seen any yet. Okay, this one here, what does it say? What is the third path? Okay, there are 4 stages of Arya, noble attainments, right? The first path is the Sotapan. This is the stream winner. When a person attains the state of Sotapan, the first path or the first level, that person basically is assured that maximum within 7 human lifetimes. That means, we unless we become enlightened, we are reborn life after life. So if you are able to attain the first path to become a Sotapan, then within 7 lifetimes, that means 7 rebirth maximum. It may not even need 7, but maximum 7 rebirth as a human being, you would have attained arahantship. You would have attained to become the arahant. So this is really the meaning of the Sotapan, 7 times returner. The second level, the second path, that is the Sakadagami. The Sakadagami is referred to as the once returner. Once returner means if you cultivate yourself, you have attained Sotapan, now you go on to attain the second path, and that is the Sakadagami. Then you may pass away without becoming enlightened, but your next life, your next rebirth as a human being, that means 1 lifetime, you would become arahant. You would attain arahantship. You would become enlightened within your next rebirth, right? So that's why they call it once returner. The Sakadagami is the once returner. And then the third path is the Anagami, and this is called the non-returner. Non-returner means a person who has gone through the cultivation, become a Sotapan, and then went on to become a Sakadagami, and then within that same lifetime, right, he continued to practice, he would attain arahantship within that lifetime. By the time he passed away, he would pass away and become an arahant and not be reborn ever again. So in other words, the Anagami is a non-returner who will never be reborn again. He would attain arahantship. However, it is possible a person has cultivated and attained this third path, Anagami, but somehow the opportunity or the conditions were not right for him to become an arahant before he passed away. So he could pass away. So when he passed away without becoming an arahant, he would be reborn in the higher Brahma realm. And this is the Sudavasa realm. This is the very high Brahma realm. Now, the Buddha in his past lives, right, as a Bodhisattva, was never reborn in that realm, because anyone who is reborn in that realm, right, when they pass on, they would become arahant. So the Anagami who was not able to attain arahantship within their last human lifetime, they will never be reborn as a human anymore. They will be reborn in the higher Brahma realm, and that is the Suddhavasa realm. And there, when they pass on, they would become Arahant. Right? So I hope this answers your question, Sister Jeanette. Very happy to see your question, Sister Jeanette from Philippines. Very happy to see you present. Thank you. Sadhu to you for making it. Right. So I hope that answered your question. Right. When they say 7 lifetime, it is 7 human lifetime. Then when they say once returner, it's talking about returning as a human once. Non-returner means you will never be reborn as a human, and when that is the anagami, the third path. So when you die, you will be reborn in the highest Deva realm, and that is the Suddhavasa realm. Right? And there, when you pass on, you would have attained arahantship. Right? You would have been reborn as an anagami there. So I hope that is clear. All right. So there's no more questions. So we have spent this last 1.5 hours together sharing the Dharma. I hope you have all benefited from that. Thank you, Sister Janet, for confirming. Okay. You have still one more question. Let me take a look. Okay. It did. I wonder, after Buddha Parinibbana, is there who at least Sotapan? So I take it your question means after the Buddha's passing, was there anyone who had attained Sotapan? Yes, there would have been. There would also have been Arahants since then. And I also understand that even in modern day today, there are Arahants, except that they are not commonly known. I'm just sharing what I have heard. And I won't mention names, but I did hear this from a very senior, very well respected, highly intellectual monk. And I also revere him as a teacher. He's also one of my teachers. And he did explain to me once that there was an Arahant in Sri Lanka who passed away at the beginning of 2018. Now, there was no mention if there were any other Arahants. So we have to be very careful, right? So we don't go around simply saying, oh, this person is Arahant, that person is Arahant. But from the mention of such highly notable monks who point out that such a person was an Arahant, I also accept that, as some declaration that there was such an Arahant in Sri Lanka who passed away at the beginning of 2018. In fact, that was the same year that Bhante Punnaji passed away. Okay, so definitely after the passing of the Buddha, there would be many Sotapan. There would also be many Sakadagami, Anagami, but I can't say very much about Arahants. But I do know that over the ages, there would have been Arahants because they have studied the Buddha's teachings, and from the Pali Canon and the teachings, they practice themselves using the teachings of the Buddha, the Eightfold Way. Eventually, they would have attained arahantship. Okay, so I'm glad that you have benefited from that, Sister Jeanette. Okay, so we spent the last 90 minutes together sharing the Dharma. And we know that there are a lot of people around the world still suffering from the effects of the global pandemic. So let's put our palms together, right, and share the merits we have accumulated with these people who may be still suffering from the pandemic, and we dedicate the merits to them. Let's put our palms together and recite together. We dedicate the merits we have acquired from sharing the Buddha Dharma to all beings affected by the coronavirus pandemic around the world. May suffering beings be suffering free. May the fear-struck fearless be. May grieving beings shed all grief. May all beings find peace and relief. By the grace of the merits we have acquired, May we never follow the foolish. May we follow only the wise until we attain the highest and most supreme bliss of Nibbana. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you have all benefited from it. So may you and your family be well, comfortable, peaceful, and happy. Have a good evening for those of you who are in this part of the world. And those of you who are in America, have a good morning. And those of you who are in Europe, have a good afternoon. Thank you very much. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.